I still remember the sound of the front door clicking shut that Tuesday afternoon. It was a soft noise, almost polite, as if James didn't want to disturb me even as he walked out of our life together. 32 years of marriage, gone with the turn of a knob. I stood in the kitchen, a half-peeled potato in one hand, the peeler trembling in the other, staring at the spot where he'd left his note. "I need to find myself," it said in his neat, slanting handwriting. "I'm sorry, Ellen." No explanation, no warning. Just those words on a scrap of paper torn from the notepad we use for grocery lists. We'd built a quiet, steady life together. Not perfect, mind you, whose is? But solid. 3 kids raised and sent off into the world. A mortgage paid down. A garden I tended until the roses climbed the trellis like they owned it. I thought we were past the storms, settled into that comfortable stretch where you don't question the silences anymore. Apparently I was wrong. The first few days I didn't cry. I kept peeling potatoes, watering the roses, folding his shirts that still hung in the closet, because I couldn't bear to pack them away. I told myself he'd come back. He always did when he got restless. Those fishing trips with his buddies, the weekend he needed space and slept on the couch. But this time the house stayed empty. The kids called worried, but I brushed them off. "He'll be back," I said, my voice steady as a drum. I almost believed it. Then a week later I saw them. I'd gone to the grocery store, routine, normal, a way to keep my hands busy. I was reaching for a can of peaches when I spotted him across the aisle. James in his old flannel shirt, the one I'd patched at the elbow last winter. He was laughing, head tilted back, the way he used to when our youngest, Tim, told one of his terrible knock-knock jokes. My chest tightened with relief, until I saw who he was laughing with. My mother. She was there, all 78 years of her, in a bright yellow cardigan I'd given her for Christmas 2 years ago. Her silver hair caught the fluorescent light as she touched his arm, her fingers lingering a beat too long. I froze, the can slipping from my hand. It hit the floor with a dull thud, rolling under the shelf. They didn't notice. They just kept walking, her basket swinging between them, his hand brushing hers as he pointed at something on the shelf. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the space they'd left behind. My mind spun like a top, excuses piling up, then crumbling just as fast. Maybe she'd run into him. Maybe they were just catching up. But the laughter, the ease between them, it wasn't the way a son-in-law chats with his wife's mother. It was something else, something that made my stomach twist into knots. I abandoned my cart and drove home, the steering wheel slick under my palms. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined it. A trick of the light, a moment stretched too thin by my own paranoia. But deep down I knew better. That night I sat on the couch with a cup of tea I didn't drink, the TV flickering silently, and wondered how long it had been going on. Sleep didn't come that night. The couch became my refuge, the cushion still holding the faint indent of James's shape from all those years of Sunday football. I kept replaying the grocery store scene, his laugh, her touch, until my head ached. By morning the tea was cold, and my resolve was thinner than the steam curling off it. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. The phone rang at 8:17 a.m., sharp and insistent. I jolted upright, heart racing, half expecting it to be James with some clumsy explanation. But the caller ID flashed Mom. My stomach dropped. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, my voice a brittle, "Hello, Ellen, darling." Her tone was bright, like she was calling to chat about her hydrangeas. "I haven't heard from you in days. Everything all right?" I gripped the receiver, my knuckles whitening. "Fine," I said, too quick. "Just busy." "You?" "Oh, you know me keeping busy. I've been out and about more lately. Keeps the joints from stiffening up." She laughed, a little trill that grated against my nerves. "Say, have you talked to James recently?" The question landed like a stone in my chest. I swallowed, tasting bile. "Not since he left," I said carefully. "Why?" "Oh, no reason," she said, breezy as a summer wind. "I just wondered. He's been so quiet lately, hasn't he?" "Quiet?" He'd been laughing with her in aisle 6 yesterday. I wanted to scream it, to demand what she was playing at, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead I mumbled, "I guess so." We danced around small talk for a few more minutes, her garden, the weather, a neighbor's yappy dog, before she hung up with a cheery "love you." I sat there, the phone still warm in my hand, feeling like I just lost a game I didn't know I was playing. That afternoon I drove past her house. I hadn't planned to. I'd meant to go to the library, lose myself in a book, but my hands turned the wheel, and there I was idling across the street from her tidy bungalow. Her car was in the driveway, but James's truck wasn't. Relief flickered, then faded. It didn't mean anything. He could have parked around back, or maybe he wasn't there yet. I almost left, but then the front door opened and out she came, watering can in hand, humming something I couldn't place. She looked happy. Happier than I'd seen her in years since Dad passed. The lines on her face seemed softer, her step lighter. I watched her tend the petunias, my fingers drumming the steering wheel, until a neighbor waved at me. I panicked and sped off, my cheeks burning. Back home I dug through the desk drawer where James kept his odds and ends, receipts, old keys, a battered address book. I flipped through it, half hoping for a clue, half dreading what I might find. Nothing jumped out. No secret numbers, no cryptic notes. Just the mundane scraps of a life I thought I knew. That's when the doorbell rang. I froze, the address book still open in my lap. Through the peephole I saw my daughter Sarah standing on the porch, her arms crossed and her brow furrowed. She looked like she had something to say, and not the kind of news you want to hear. "Mom," she said when I opened the door, her voice tight. "We need to talk about Dad." "And Grandma." Sarah marched inside before I could invite her, her sneakers squeaking on the hardwood. She dropped her purse on the couch and turned to me, hands on her hips. At 28, she still had that fierce look she'd get as a kid when she caught her brothers sneaking cookies, determined, unyielding. "Mom, what's going on with Dad?" she asked, skipping any preamble. "Tim called me yesterday, said he saw him at the hardware store with Grandma, buying paint." "Paint? Like they were decorating or something?" I blinked, the room tilting slightly. "Paint?" I echoed, my voice hollow. The image of James and my mother picking out colors, maybe a soft blue or cheery yellow, stabbed at me. Our bedroom walls were still the faded beige we'd chosen together decades ago. He'd never cared about paint before. "Yeah," Sarah said, pacing now. "Tim thought it was weird, but he didn't say anything to them. He just watched them leave together, laughing like old pals. Mom, it's not normal. Dad walks out and now he's what? Buddying up with Grandma." I sank into the armchair, the address book still clutched in my lap. "I saw them too," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "At the grocery store. They didn't see me, but they looked close. Too close." Sarah stopped pacing, her eyes widening. "Close how?" "Like they were." I hesitated, the thought too absurd to voice. "Comfortable. Familiar. I don't know how to explain it." She stared at me, then shook her head. "This is nuts. Grandma's almost 80, Mom. Dad's 59. What are we even suggesting here?" "I don't know," I said, rubbing my temples. "Maybe I'm losing it. Maybe it's nothing." But Sarah wasn't buying it. She grabbed her phone from her purse and started scrolling. "Tim said something else," she muttered, thumbs flying over the screen. "He saw Grandma post a picture on Facebook last week, her and Dad at the park feeding ducks. She captioned it, 'Good company.' I didn't think much of it then, but now." She held out the phone. There it was, James grinning beside my mother on a bench, a flock of ducks waddling at their feet. Her arm was looped through his, her head tilted toward him. The timestamp was 3 days after he'd left me. My throat tightened, and I handed the phone back without a word. "Okay," Sarah said, pocketing it. "We need to figure this out. I'll call Tim, see if he's noticed anything else. You should talk to Grandma, get her side." "I already did," I said, thinking of that morning's call. She acted like everything's fine. Asked about James like she didn't know where he was. Sarah frowned. "Then we go to Dad. Confront him." The idea made my stomach lurch. "He won't talk to me. He hasn't answered my calls since he left." "Then I'll do it," she said, her jaw set. "He can't dodge all of us." Before I could protest, she was dialing. The line rang twice before clicking to voicemail. James's voice, calm and clipped. "Leave a message." Sarah hung up, muttering under her breath, then typed a quick text. "Dad, call me. Now." We waited, the silence stretching thin. 10 minutes later, her phone buzzed. She answered on the first ring. "Dad? Where are you?" I couldn't hear his reply, but Sarah's face hardened. "With Grandma? Why? No, don't give me that. Mom's a mess and you're what? Helping her with a project. She paused listening, then shot me a look I couldn't read. Fine. I'm coming over there. We're sorting this out. She hung up and grabbed her keys. He's at Grandma's. Says it's not what we think. I'm going. You coming? I hesitated, fear and curiosity warring inside me. Finally I nodded. Let's go. The drive to my mother's house felt endless, even though it was just 10 minutes across town. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale, while I stared out the window at the familiar streets blurring past. The roses in Mrs. Carter's yard, the oak tree where James once carved our initials, every landmark mocked me with memories of a life that no longer fit. We pulled into the driveway behind my mother's sedan. James's truck was there too, parked crooked like he'd been in a hurry. The sight of it twisted something sharp in my chest. Sarah didn't wait, she was out of the car and halfway to the door before I'd unbuckled. I followed, my legs heavy, dread pooling in my stomach. Sarah rang the bell, then pounded on the door for good measure. Dad. Grandma. Open up. The door swung inward and there was my mother, still in that yellow cardigan, her smile faltering as she saw us. Sarah? Ellen? What's this about? Where's Dad? Sarah demanded, pushing past her. I stepped in more slowly, my eyes darting around the living room. It looked the same, crocheted afghans, Dad's old recliner, photos of us kids on the mantel, but something felt off. A pair of men's boots sat by the couch. James's boots. He's in the kitchen, my mother said, her voice too bright. We're just having tea. Come in, Ollie. Tea. Sarah cut her off, storming toward the kitchen. I trailed behind, my mother's hand brushing my arm as I passed. It was a light touch, almost pleading, but I didn't stop. James was there, leaning against the counter, a mug in his hand. He straightened when he saw us, his face flickering between surprise and resignation. Ellen, he said, setting the mug down. Sarah. I didn't expect. What are you doing here, Dad? Sarah snapped. You leave Mom and now you're hanging out with Grandma like nothing's wrong? It's not what you think, he said quickly, holding up his hands. I'm helping your grandmother with something. A project. A project, I repeated, my voice flat. That's why you've been buying paint? Feeding ducks? Laughing in grocery stores? His eyes widened, caught off guard. You saw that? I saw enough, I said, stepping closer. What's going on, James? After 32 years, you owe me that much. He glanced at my mother, who'd followed us in and now hovered by the doorway, wringing her hands. Ellen, I didn't mean to hurt you, he said. I just needed a change. And your mom, she needed help. Help with what? Sarah pressed, crossing her arms. My mother cleared her throat, stepping forward. It's my fault, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I asked James to stay here. The house, it's too much for me alone now. Leaky pipes, peeling paint. He's been fixing things. I stared at her, then at him. You couldn't tell me that? You had to sneak around. It's not sneaking, James said, exasperation creeping into his tone. I didn't know how to explain it without upsetting you. I thought you'd understand eventually. Understand what? I shot back. That you'd rather play handyman for her than come home? It's not like that, my mother interjected. Ellen, please. Sit down. Let's talk. But Sarah wasn't having it. No. This doesn't add up. You two are too cozy. The park, the store, what's really going on? James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I'll admit it looks strange. But it's innocent. Your grandmother's lonely, Sarah. Since your grandpa died, she's been rattling around here by herself. I've been keeping her company, that's all. Company, I said softly, the word tasting bitter. I looked at my mother, searching her face. Her eyes were wide, earnest, but there was something else there, a flicker I couldn't place. Before I could press further, the back door creaked open. We all turned as a man stepped inside, tall, gray-haired, wearing a tool belt. Hey, Ruth, he called to my mother. Got that pipe fixed. Who are your guests? James froze. Sarah's mouth dropped open. And I felt the room spin as I realized we weren't the only ones keeping secrets. The man stood in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, oblivious to the storm he just walked into. His gray hair was mussed, his flannel shirt streaked with grease, and that tool belt clinked softly as he shifted his weight. He looked at us, me, Sarah, James, my mother, like we were a puzzle he hadn't expected to solve. Ruth, he said again, nodding at my mother. Everything okay? She recovered first, smoothing her cardigan with a nervous smile. Oh yes, Carl. Fine, fine. These are my daughter, Ellen, and my granddaughter, Sarah. And James, of course. Carl tipped his head, friendly but curious. Nice to meet you folks. Didn't mean to interrupt. You're not, James said quickly, stepping forward. Too quickly. Carl's been helping with the plumbing. Right, Ruth? Yes, my mother agreed, her voice a shade too eager. The kitchen sink's been a nightmare. Carl's a godsend. I stared at her, then at James, then at this Carl who was now setting his rag on the counter like he owned the place. Wait, I said, my mind scrambling to catch up. If Carl's fixing the pipes, what are you doing here, James? He hesitated, just a beat, but it was enough. I told you, he said. General stuff. Painting, yard work. Ruth needed more than one pair of hands. Sarah snorted, crossing her arms. So you're both her handyman now? That's convenient. Sarah, my mother said, a warning in her tone. It's not like that. Carl's a neighbor. He offered to help when he saw James struggling with the pipes last week. Last week? I echoed, turning to James. You've been here that long? He rubbed his jaw, avoiding my eyes. On and off. It's a big house, Ellen. Things pile up. Carl chuckled, breaking the tension or making it worse, I couldn't tell. Yeah, this place is a fixer-upper's dream. Ruth's lucky to have us both pitching in. I didn't like his tone, that easy familiarity. And I didn't like the way my mother smiled at him, like they shared some private joke. How long have you known my mom? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Oh, a while, Carl said, shrugging. Moved in down the street a couple years back. We chat over the fence now and then. Chat, Sarah muttered, shooting me a look. I knew what she was thinking. This was getting weirder by the minute. Anyway, Carl said, oblivious to the undertow, I'll head out. Sink's good as new, Ruth. Let me know if that faucet acts up again. He nodded at us and ambled out the back door, leaving a faint whiff of pipe cleaner behind. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with questions no one wanted to ask. Sarah broke it first. Okay, someone explain this. Dad's here fixing stuff, Carl's here fixing stuff, and Mom's in the dark about all of it. What am I missing? Nothing, James said firmly. You're making it into something it's not. Then why didn't you tell me? I snapped, the hurt spilling out. You couldn't pick up the phone and say, hey, Ellen, I'm helping your mom with her house? You let me think. I stopped, the words too raw to finish. Think what? He pressed, his brow furrowing. I looked at my mother, then back at him. That there's more to this. That you too. My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Ellen, how could you even suggest that? Then why the secrecy? Sarah jumped in. The park, the store, the paint, none of this adds up unless you're hiding something. We're not, James said, his voice rising. I swear it's just... The phone rang, cutting him off. My mother flinched, then hurried to answer it. Hello? Oh yes, hi. Now's not, wait, what? Her face paled, and she glanced at James, then me. No, don't come over. I'll handle it. She hung up, her hands trembling. That was Mrs. Larson next door, she said. She saw you two pull up and she's asking questions. Great, Sarah muttered. Now the neighbors are in on it. But I barely heard her. My mother's reaction, those shaky hands, that quick glance at James, lit a spark of doubt I couldn't shake. Something was wrong. And it wasn't just about paint or pipes. My mother's shaky hands stayed with me as Sarah and I drove home. She'd brushed off Mrs. Larson's call, claiming it was just nosy neighbor gossip, but her eyes had darted to James too many times. Sarah ranted beside me, this is ridiculous, Mom. They're lying about something. But I barely listened. My mind was stuck on that look, that flicker of panic. Back home, I couldn't sit still. The house felt too quiet, too empty. I wandered upstairs, past the kids' old rooms, and stopped at the attic door. James had always handled the attic, boxes of Christmas lights, tax files, junk we'd meant to sort. Maybe there'd be something there, some hint of why he'd left. The stairs creaked under my weight. Dust swirled in the dim light filtering through a tiny window. I started with a box labeled James Miscellaneous. Inside were old photos, a fishing lure, a stack of letters. My breath caught when I saw the top one, my mother's handwriting, dated 2 months ago. James, it read, I need your help. It's time. Please don't tell Ellen yet. No signature, just that. I sank onto an old trunk rereading it. Time for what? Why the secrecy? Another letter, older, mentioned the plan, vague, frustratingly so. My hand shook as I dug deeper, finding a small key taped to the bottom of the box. No label, no clue what it opened. Sarah's voice echoed up the stairs. Mom? You up there? Yeah, I called, shoving the letters back. Just looking at old stuff. She climbed up, brushing cobwebs from her hair. Find anything? I hesitated, then held out the key. This. And some letters from Grandma to Dad. They're weird, secretive. Her eyes narrowed. We need to figure out what that unlocks. Maybe it's at her house. Maybe I said, pocketing it. But as we headed downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real lock wasn't a door or a box, it was something bigger, something they were still hiding. That night, I dreamed of James and my mother laughing in a room I couldn't enter, a key dangling just out of reach. The key burned a hole in my pocket all morning. I barely touched my coffee, my mind spinning with possibilities, a safe, a trunk, something James and my mother didn't want me to find. Sarah was right, we needed to go back to her house. But I couldn't face them again, not yet. Not without knowing more. I called Tim instead. My youngest picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy. Mom? It's early. I know, I said. Sorry. Listen, have you noticed anything strange with Dad and Grandma lately? Beyond the hardware store. He paused, then sighed. Yeah, actually. Last month, I stopped by Grandma's to drop off some firewood. Dad was there in the garage fiddling with something. They both got real quiet when I walked in, like I'd caught them at something. Fiddling with what? I pressed. Dunno. Looked like a box or a case. He shut it fast and said it was old junk. But Grandma looked nervous. I didn't push it. A box. My pulse quickened. Thanks, Tim. I'll call you later. Sarah came over an hour later, armed with determination and a plan. We sneak in, she said. Grandma's at her book club this afternoon. I checked her calendar online. Dad's probably not there either. We find whatever that key fits. Sneak in. I frowned. That's her house, Sarah. And she's your mom, she shot back. If they're hiding something, you deserve to know. She was right, though it didn't sit easy. We drove over, parking a block away like fugitives. The house was quiet, the driveway empty. Sarah fished a spare key from under the mat, same spot my mother had used for years, and we slipped inside. The air smelled of lavender and old wood. We split up. Sarah took the garage, I headed for my mother's bedroom. Her dresser caught my eye, an antique with a small locked drawer I'd never noticed before. My fingers trembled as I slid the key in. It fit. The lock clicked open. Inside was a velvet pouch, heavy in my hand. I tipped it out, a gold watch engraved with my father's initials. His retirement gift, lost years ago, or so we'd thought. Beneath it, a folded note in James's handwriting. Ruth, it's safe now. We'll finish soon. Finish what? I stared at the watch, confusion swirling. Why hide this? Mom. Sarah's hiss came from the hall. Someone's here. I shoved the note and watch back, locking the drawer just as the front door creaked. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Not my mother's shuffle or James's heavy tread. I peeked out and saw Carl, the neighbor, easing the door shut behind him, a toolbox in hand. Ellen, he said, spotting me. His brow creased. What are you doing here? I froze, the key digging into my palm. I could ask you the same. Carl set his toolbox down, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. Ruth asked me to check the furnace, he said, slow and deliberate. Said she'd be out. You didn't answer my question. I'm visiting, I stammered, clutching the key tighter. Sarah crept up behind me, silent as a shadow. Family stuff. He glanced at her, then back at me. Right. Well, I'll get to it. Basement's this way, I assume. Wait, Sarah blurted, stepping forward. Why do you keep showing up? Pipes, furnace, what's your deal? Carl raised an eyebrow, then chuckled, a dry, tired sound. My deal? I'm just the guy next door who can't say no. Ruth's been leaning on me since your grandpa passed. James too, lately. Leaning how? I asked, my voice sharp. He hesitated, rubbing his jaw. Look, I don't like meddling. But since you're here. Ruth's been off lately. Worried. Keeps talking about tying up loose ends. James has been helping her with it, more than just house stuff. Like what? Sarah pressed. Carl shrugged. Don't know the half of it. She's cagey. But last week, I overheard them in the garage, something about a promise and keeping it quiet. Thought it was odd, but it's not my business. My mind raced back to the letters, the watch, James's note. A promise. Loose ends. Did they say anything else? I asked. Not much. Ruth shut it down when she saw me. Look, I'm no snoop. I fix what's broken, go home. But if you're digging, that's where I'd start. He grabbed his toolbox and headed for the basement, leaving us in stunned silence. Sarah turned to me, eyes wide. Mom, what's Grandma hiding? And why's Dad in on it? I don't know, I whispered, pulling the key from my pocket. But this watch, it's Dad's. Lost years ago. Why's it locked up now? Sarah frowned. We need to ask them. No more sneaking. Before I could argue, my phone buzzed. Tim. Mom, he said when I answered, I just saw Dad and Grandma at the bank. They looked serious. What's going on? The bank. Another piece. We're figuring it out, I said. Stay put. Sarah grabbed her keys. Let's go. Now. Sarah sped toward the bank, my heart pounding as I gripped the key. Tim's call replayed in my head. James and my mother serious secretive. What were they doing? We pulled into the lot just as they emerged, heads bent together. A manila envelope in James's hand. Sarah honked, startling them. Dad! She yelled, jumping out. I followed, legs shaky. What's that? She demanded, pointing at the envelope. James flinched. It's nothing, bank stuff. My mother stepped forward, pale. Ellen, why are you here? Because you're lying, I said, holding up the key. This opened a drawer with Dad's watch and your note, James. Finish soon. What's it mean? They exchanged a look, panic, guilt. Not here, James muttered. Home. We'll explain. Sarah crossed her arms. You'd better. As we drove back, I clutched the key, dread mixing with hope. The truth was close, and I wasn't sure I wanted it.